Welcome, everybody, to the Loud and Drunk podcast. This is Dan. The more things change, oh boy, the more they stay the same. It seems like every offseason for the NFL, someone, somewhere, for some reason, has to bring up the Washington Red Commanderskins name for some reason. Also, they were the Washington football team club.
Something along those lines.
It's bizarre. Their name history since they changed it has been just ridiculous. Justin, I guess this has to get thrown back into the public discourse again.
Yeah, unfortunately. Us white people, we just seem to just want to be heard and be mad about something at any given moment.
Well, Moses, how are we to show people how great of a white knight we are if we don't tell them how much we care about what we think about all matters in every situation? Especially like the sports teams of all things.
Well, we do it by just kind of changing the topic and being like, we're not that bad. See, we're not racist. We have black friends.
And we have
Indian friends.
We have
Native
Indian
American
sports
friends.
teams, but then we take the logo away and the name away. And then we name them after a bridge.
Yes, Barbarian Jim here. Very happy to be here. Only non-white. Also, I think only racist. So I'm just very happy to be on the podcast.
But before we get into all of that, want to encourage you out there to subscribe to this podcast. Also, loudanddrunk.com, bookmark that today. All right, guys, let's get into this. Like I said at the top of the show, Washington Redskins, Washington Commanders, that name change has been under, in the public discourse for a long time. And it seemed like it was settled in 2020 when they changed the name to, not settled because they changed it to the Washington football team. But then eventually they came to the name Washington Commanders. Well, now it's back in the news because apparently no one has anything to talk about in the summer other than, let's just change the name again. Now they want the name to either get changed back to Redskins or just have the old logo acknowledged. And I have a article here from the Associated Press. Senator wants Washington Commanders to pay tribute to an old logo that offends many indigenous, which, pretty charged headline for a newswire.
Was this written by an indigenous person? Because I'm going to say probably not, right?
It does not appear so.
We don't let them write articles yet.
Oh, that's right.
They need to do their time here in this country.
Did indigenous people even give a shit about the change?
We can get into that in a little bit. This was written by Graham Lee Brewer.
Oh yeah, very indigenous name.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to read the very beginning part of this. Now a white this is how he writes this.
Wow.
Now a white Republican U.S. Senator from Montana is reviving the debate by blocking a bill funding the revitalization of the decrepit RFK Stadium for the Commanders, who have been playing miles away in Maryland. Senator Steve Daines says he will block the legislation until the NFL and the Commanders honor the former logo in some form.
Okay.
I know that you've already kind of acknowledged this, but I just really want to draw attention to that. Like you said, a Republican senator, that's gonna be a white person. You don't need to spell that out. Also, they're a human being and they live in America.
Especially if his name is Graham.
Yeah.
He's from Montana.
Obviously.
Why does he give a shit about Washington football at all?
Well, I can get into that in this article, but Graham is the person who wrote the article.
He's the writer.
I thought that was the all right.
So there is actually a part of this. I can get into it because they actually do some journalism here. It's not all opinion, which is weird because, Associated Press, it should be just a newswire. The original logo was designed by a member of the Blackfeet Nation in the state of Montana. Some tribal members take pride in it and the legacy of the man who helped design it in the early 70s. Walter Blackie Wetzel, a former Blackfeet Nation tribal chairman, and former president of the National Congress of the American Indian, the country's oldest Native American and Alaska Native advocacy organization. Wetzel's family says Daines and Wetzel's son Don, who died last year at 74, formed a friendship that may be fueling the senator's fight for the logo. Indian country is typically a bipartisan Indian country is typically a bipartisan topic in Congress. Daines sits on the Senate Committee for Indian Affairs and has worked with Democratic colleagues on clean water access for tribal communities. He has supported the passage of a Truth and Healing Commission to investigate the history of Indian boarding schools, a bill carried by Senator Elizabeth Warren, a Democrat from Massachusetts. Moses, did that answer your question in any shape, way, or form?
No, I have more. Is he from the Wetzel Pretzel family?
I
can only assume, yes.
How many Wetzels could there be?
He's the king of derailment.
I don't care about
I'm
sports. I
curious
care
about
about pretzels.
his like a part of his name was Blackie.
Yes, Walter Blackie Wetzel was the former Blackfeet Nation tribal
So
chairman.
his middle name is Blackie.
Yes.
Right. So why aren't Republican senators investigating that? Because that's actually quite offensive to black people.
Well, it's Native American, so.
Well,
Should-
yeah.
should
But I mean,
be
so
offensive
then
to
he has
everyone?
no right to use that word. He has no right. I personally am offended by it. Let's get into that later, though.
The world goes round and round and round.
And then we have something from, oh boy, you'll love this source, Fox News.
Mhm.
Lovely.
Commander's nickname change on the side for now, team's co-owner says. Marjorie Harris, a co-owner of the Washington Commanders and wife of Josh Harris, was asked Wednesday about the potential of changing the team's name. The team announced it would be the Commanders before the 2022 season, moving from the Washington football team, which is a stupid name, and the Washington Redskins. However, the Commanders faced a lawsuit in September 2023 from the Native American Guardians Association, NAGA.
Wow. Awesome.
I feel like
That's
this is
great.
just.
I feel like
being
I feel
played
like
here.
maybe Dan's like punking us. I don't know enough about this subject.
It's like we're talking about Native Americans, right?
Is any of
Dan?
his equipment hooked up to anything?
Over the nickname change. New head coach Dan Quinn also wore a t-shirt that featured the feather on the original Redskins logo and the new W in the Commanders logo. The Washington Post also added that only 16% of fans think the team should keep the nickname. So there's
What is the all right? So there's like the
Commanders.
name, and what's the nick? That's the nickname.
Yeah, the nickname is the Washington Commander. I mean, the Commanders would be the nickname.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what is the official name of the team?
It would be the Washington Commanders, I guess.
Oh,
but like
oh,
the nickname, like Washington, and yeah. This is.
I'm
just the
sorry,
way-
I'm getting into the weeds on something so inconsequential.
Yeah, I got a little lost myself.
So now they're called the Washington Blackies. Yeah, 'cause that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, because that's less offensive.
Well, yeah, we don't want to offend the Native Americans.
Yeah.
Listen, that was in the AP story.
Yeah.
You can't throw that at me.
I don't know. I like honestly, like you read off all of these things, and like I could see some confusion on your face, but it's like we're supposed to call people who are like from this country before white people got here, they're indigenous or native or something like that. And yet all of these groups, and I understand they were named a long time ago, but they all have Indian in the name, which so it's like it's a group that calls itself we're the Indian caucus for like calling people natives. And then that's, I don't know. It's just very confusing.
Yeah, yeah.
And a little frustrating then.
It's just because government is filled with mostly white people, so you have to, as being like on that low totem pole, being an indigenous person, you gotta just use the words that they're comfortable with.
See, now, Moses, I have a question for you then, because like you're saying that the government's mostly filled with white people, but obviously the people who populated this country when white people got here, they were all Native Americans. So why are Native Americans not making up the majority of you know, our government apparatus?
Firewater.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, and polio.
It's I'm drinking a little firewater right now myself.
Well, they could always change the name of these committees, like the Cleveland Indians did, and just call it the Guardians.
Yeah, there we are with that.
You can always name it after a bridge.
Ooh,
Yeah.
the Washington Virtue.
Is that a thing?
That's a good football name.
Is that a thing?
Washington Virtue.
Yeah.
I think we're talking about it.
Okay. I love that.
The White Knights.
Yeah.
The white. Yeah.
Yeah,
Very nice. Yeah.
that actually makes the most amount of sense.
That makes more sense than the virtue thing. Yeah.
But guys, this brings me to a larger topic at hand, because every once in a while we have something like this come up where something's deemed offensive, and then either it gets taken down, and then we have a little backlash like this with the Washington Redskins, Commanders, what have you. But it doesn't really seem to change, because it's happened a lot in sports, and it's happened a lot in media. So, like, as I already alluded to in that little joke, the Cleveland Indians had to change their name to the Cleveland Guardians. And now it's kind of like you took away a little bit of the history. Now we can talk a little bit about that logo, because the idea that the Redskins logo, now you can make a really strong case that that name is offensive.
Sure.
But you're going to, if you look at the logo, look, well, that's offensive. Well, he's just kind of like standing there. And it's like nothing
Yeah.
really, it's like
I feel like that's a
stereotypical.
more respectable, at least, image
Yeah.
than the Cleveland Indian,
Yeah,
which
look-
was just a Looney Tunes character.
But it was also, yeah, like Chief Wahoo was just like this really stereotypical, like this big Looney Tunes-esque, you know, smile on his face. Like, yes, this-
Cherub-faced Indian.
yeah, it was really like out there. But it was like logos back in the day were also very cartoonish. Like,
Yeah,
the freaking Baltimore Orioles logo was an Oriole that was giving you a big old smile with a ball cap on its head.
Yeah.
Like, Orioles don't really look like that.
And yet the Philly Fanatic looks exactly like most of Philadelphia.
That's true. That's true.
But a lot of this also came even before everything that was happening in 2020. There were like colleges that were changing their names, like the college that I went to, Quinnipiac.
Oh, right.
They were the Quinnipiac Braves. And they decided to change their name to something that's significantly less historic. Oh, the Quinnipiac Bobcats. Congratulations. You are the 150th team to be named Bobcats of all things. So there's something to be said about if you're going to change the name of a team, how much damage do you take away from, first of all, the community that you could potentially be supporting? Because a lot of these sports organizations give money to their local tribes because they're using their name, essentially using their name or likeness or anything of that nature. And then you just give it to some generic animal, or like, I think like the Utah hockey team is not going to be called the Yeti. So it's just like,
so.
And then like Seattle went with the Kraken. So it's just like,
Kraken.
Yeah, you run into this little balance between you can go something historic and you pay potential homage, and it could be taken to be something offensive, or you go so bland and generic that it's not to offend anybody, and you're like, oh, okay, that's the name of your team? What does that have to do with fuck all?
Dan, we're the Milk Toasts. And,
Yes.
and we're going to win it this year.
What are we going to win?
The sport ball. Sport ball championship.
Really getting after it this year.
You heard it here, folks. Put that on the. Gonna
Place your bets now.
You're
going to want to get into the ground floor.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to give you another example as well. In North Dakota, their university, they were known as the Fighting Sioux, which is a very specific tribe, and they changed it to the Fighting Hawks, which is another example of like, okay, how are you? First of all, how are the Hawks fighting?
Right,
but like. When you're doing this little delicate dance to be so inoffensive, it just becomes so bland and meaningless, other than just like, oh, hey, maybe you just don't make your logo look criminally offensive and just move on.
And it's like, and I guess I'm like maybe jumping the gun on this, but it's like, I'm kind of like approaching it from this perspective of, first of all, that everything could be offensive to somebody. I mean, you want to rename from, like, I understand the Sioux is like a very specific group of people identify that way. But there's also a very large group of people who are falconeers that have a big love of hawks and don't want to see them to, being exploited for the purposes of, profiteering off of sports and such like that. So I feel like you could make the same argument there. It's maybe not the same argument, but I mean, it's a valid argument based off of the original reasoning.
There was a joke argument when the Miami Dolphins changed their logo and took the helmet off of them.
Right.
There's like, oh, well, now PETA's got to throw a fit because they took the helmet off of the Dolphins.
Exactly.
And so now his chances of getting CTE without that helmet is
you've got
skyrocket.
And on top of that, like CTE is a real threat for people who are bipedal mammals that specialize in the sport that we've created. And now you're taking a sea mammal, doesn't even have any legs. You're throwing it in the middle of a football field with no helmet. I mean, this animal is probably going to suffer some serious brain injury. So I could absolutely see the offense there.
To backtrack a little bit, I can't remember which team you mentioned, but the original artwork was created by a member of...
That was the Redskins.
That was
logo.
the Redskins.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's where they're like, sort of like the discussion of that logo kind of goes into play, because there are people that are offended by it. There are a collection of Native American people that are offended by it.
I'm sure.
And there's also a collection of Native American people that are like, no, that doesn't bother me at all because it honors our people. So you run that balance. Like, and it seems like to me, at least, and maybe I'm jumping a little bit of the gun when I say this, that it's not so much the group of people that might be affected by it. We've already kind of hinted at it, that it's just white people that just jump the gun and like, oh, I gotta step in and be offended on behalf of these poor noble savages.
I'm an ally.
Yes, they do that type of thing, and it just seems to me that when you start to just try to white knight it like that, you're first of all you're robbing those people of their own autonomy. They can make up their own minds if they find that shit offensive.
Well, I mean that would be true if they weren't noble savages then. But I mean, the truth of it is that I think that there's a certain responsibility that white people hold as obviously the most advanced race, where they do need to step in and kind of defend some of these other people, if we're going to use that word.
I don't think we were, but go on.
And you are, what was your name again? Barbarian Jim or Jim Barbarian?
It's Barbarian Jim. That is my name. Yeah.
That's my
tribal name. Yeah, you should write it down. I'm going to be somebody one day.
Not having you on the podcast again. All right, keep going.
He said he was a racist.
Yeah, I led with that. Yeah. Led with that one.
Who books these guests again?
We're still trying to figure that out. They kind of just
Whoever's
show up
outside.
every week.
How do I not know?
I think it's like a haunted house scenario because I definitely like received a phone call and it wasn't from any of you.
I was coming from inside the bar.
We
Yeah.
definitely have like a weird specter in our workflow.
Yeah.
I've got to fire that intern.
But like with all the outrage and stuff like that about, say, that particular logo, like the real cartoony red face one, like give it to a member of those people and have them, like an artist of their
Draw it
choosing,
up.
kind of choose their own.
But if this is exactly what we would want to do, the Redskins logo was designed by a group of Native Americans.
Yeah.
So if that was deemed offensive, then what can we do to actually please the easily offended
Like, I don't
white
care
people?
what the white people have to say about this.
But they're the ones that are always going to do it.
I know. We're so
within-
loud.
and I think that within any group, you're going to have, basically, like you could put it up to, if you need to make a stereotype of like, we talked about Notre Dame the other
Yes.
day.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Well,
Well, that's a different place. It's Notre Dame. Notre Dame is in France.
No,
Not
Listen, this is my accent speaking right now.
That's the racism coming out.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I can't leave it behind. I do.
Well, if he's
apologize.
racist, he should be xenophobic too. So he should have plenty of things to say about the French.
It's a different dialect of
Man,
racism.
is that a thing that we can talk about, the French? Well, let's circle back to that one because I actually do. But I think that if you look at any, like if we want to identify people as like these groups, and sometimes we define ourselves that way, like people say I'm Irish or I'm Sioux or I'm black or I'm white, and those are like self-identified people. And then obviously we also do that to other people where we don't belong to that group. But if you want to, no matter how you slice that and you break people down into these identity groups, then you're always going to have a situation where, you're never going to get a situation where every white person agrees with the other white people about what a good representation is.
Yeah.
Or with the Sioux or with black people, anybody,
Yeah.
any so-called group on the planet, you're never going to have that. So you're always going to have some like part of it that feels like that it's being done wrong or they feel disenfranchised by it or so on and so forth. So then the question becomes much more so about like, at what point is it still okay to do it, even though somebody's going to be offended? Is it okay to offend people sometimes? I think that's really like the core of the question. Can you offend people and not be wrong?
You know for a fact you cannot offend people. Not allowed.
First of all, I offend people all the time, so that's just a lie.
He's doing that right now on this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think that's an important question to ask too, because I personally believe in order to think freely, you must risk being offensive.
Of course.
Because whatever I say on this podcast, if you're listening to this podcast right now and you disagree with me, you might find what I'm saying to be offensive. But you might also I'm going to listen to this person and I'm going to hear them out. And at the end of the day, you're like, he was kind of a little offensive, but maybe he was a little right. So you have to kind of sparse
You can't
out.
just shut down when something takes that box in your head.
And not even necessarily right. Yes, some people will have that perspective, but even if you listen to somebody and it's offensive and you think that they're wrong, that's still okay.
Yeah.
Because in other words, it's kind of like understanding that people will have different perspective about you, from you. And sometimes they'll be about your core beliefs and things where you're going to get riled up about it. I think there's a big difference between that type of a thing and where it enters into what I think most reasonable people consider to be, more dangerous or unfriendly territory, where you're trying to truly make certain groups feel like they're not, a part of the whole. Because we're really just talking about human beings.
Yeah.
Everybody is a part of that big group. And I think that if if what you're saying is trying to say that somebody's not a part of that, then that's obviously a dangerous territory that's gotten humanity into a lot of problems in the past and still today. But if it's merely acknowledging a difference, that can certainly be offensive to somebody, but it doesn't mean that it's inherently wrong in some way. In other words, differences are real between people. They're not fundamental, but it's the same way as there's differences between individuals. People vary and we form these groups, and it's not inherently wrong to acknowledge that or in some way try to, maybe draw attention to it sometimes, which could be positive or negative. But unless it's hurting somebody, in a meaningful way, then I question how much you should be offended by it.
And that leads me also into, there's actually more to this as well, because the Chiefs do this, Florida State University does this, the Atlanta Braves does this. It's the tomahawk chop.
Oh, yeah.
Which is like some people. I remember when like the Taylor Swift, Travis Kelce story was starting to blow up, and a lot of people were like, "Oh, I hope that like Taylor Swift says something," and they saw like she makes them stop doing it.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of that thrown around.
And it to me, that's just so inherently like, unless they're doing it and you know their intent in their hearts that like when they go, oh, that they're doing that to be racist, or maybe they're just doing it. Well, first of all, it's the name of a fucking sports team. So most of these fucking people are probably just doing it because they had like 17 beers deep and they're just super into everything right now. But do you know the intent of these sports fans? Are they doing it to be racist? Or are they doing this to celebrate the culture? Or is there something in between? Like kind of like what I'm getting at.
Don't like, confuse ignorance with malice.
Yes.
That's a big thing.
But, I think some of the loudest people are people that just want to be on Team Mad.
Yeah. Yeah, because you get that that dopamine hit from being mad all the time. It actually feels good to get mad. And people do that just try to get that next rush. Mm-hmm. And also you can having somebody bend to your whim when you get mad.
Well, it's a result. Yeah, so you get a charge off of that.
You get the dopamine hit from that, but it just starts getting to be like crack. You're like, oh, I can actually get people to do what I want just by throwing a fucking tantrum.
Well, it's because I am doing something that is an effect and is getting a result.
It's a Karen thing.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the other application, I guess.
Yes, exactly. Before we move on from the sports aspect of this, because I actually want to get into a little bit of the media as well, because this happens all the time in media as well. Can I share a story with you guys?
Please.
I have said on the podcast before, and I apologize for it, that I was a Philadelphia Flyers fan. Mm-hmm. And I figured this is a good time to explain why I'm not anymore. So without a lot of the sports nonsense in there, I covered that team for a little bit. I'd go up to the press box and cover the games and all that stuff. I wrote for a blog. I got to learn like a little bit like how much of a piece of shit like most Philadelphia sports fans are. Like I knew that as a fan already, but then like
they're a special breed.
Yeah. And then like just like kind of like how we're doing this podcast right now. Mm-hmm. I did a podcast for that particular blog, and you get the feedback, the negative feedback of what you're putting out into the world. It's like, well, you're kind of like, all you do is want to tear things down.
Right.
And so I really stopped getting the motivation to contribute to that because of all the negativity. And then finally, to tie it into what we're talking about, do you guys know who Kate Smith is?
Yes.
She was brought in like the Flyers came into existence, I think, in like 1968. So somewhere around like the 70s, Vietnam's going on. Mm-hmm. And they're not playing the national anthem because of, all of the civil unrest and, race protests and all that stuff. So they were trying to explore what they could do to play and still have, a moment to honor the country. And it was Kate Smith's rendition of God Bless America.
Right.
And it quickly became their good luck charm because they seldom lost when they played that song. So much so that they brought Kate Smith onto the ice for Game 6 of the Stanley Cup final, and they won that game. And it was so known that it was their good luck charm that, who was it? Phil Esposito approached her on the ice with roses to try and freaking to undo the good luck charm. Didn't work. So fast forward, 2019, all the cancel culture stuff is happening. And her rendition of God Bless America had been grafted onto the New York Yankees. They would play it during the 7th inning stretch.
Oh, that's right. Yes.
And so at one point, someone complained that Kate Smith was a racist and she wore blackface. And you shouldn't play that anymore. And it trickled down. Like the Flyers caught wind of it. They had a statue.
I remember this whole thing happening, yeah.
And they took her rendition of God Bless America out of the jukebox. It used to be a duet with their anthem singer, Lauren Hart. Everyone dismissed her as a racist. No one looked 2 seconds into this. They were like, she's just a racist. She's old, she's dead, and she's a racist. Not worth fighting. And then if you look into some of the stuff that she had done in her history, she caught, shit for wearing blackface for certain musicals that she did earlier on in her career. But that's how you broke into the business. Mm-hmm. And so when you graft onto your 2019 perspective onto that, of course, you're going to find it offensive. Yeah. But what is she supposed to do?
Right.
Like, how is she supposed to get into the business?
And to clarify that, it's that at the time, there was no, simply blackface was a standard of the industry.
Because black people weren't allowed to have
exactly. Black people were not allowed to do these things, so you were more or less roped into it. Yeah. And it raises the interesting question of if you didn't allow blackface, there would be no representation.
Yeah.
So is it better to have this racist representation done by a white person or to simply not have it at all? And then you just don't acknowledge that black people are a part of America. Obviously, the ideal situation is that black people would be portrayed portraying themselves, that we didn't live like in this apartheid country at that time.
Yeah.
But that's what it comes down to.
And then-
it's putting modern optics on a world that existed in a totally different way.
Time frame. And you have no concept of it too.
Right.
And you're still treating it as if she would have your perspective, but there's no way that she could possibly have
No,
your perspective.
never.
You have a better chance of trying to understand her perspective through history, through textbooks and all that stuff. But you choose not to. You choose to look at, well, if I lived in 1930, 1940, I would have been, on the side. I would have been marching with all.
Yeah,
like,
no, you
black
don't
people
know
to get
that.
percent.
No one-
You would not.
No.
You would not. You would have just gotten in line like everyone else did.
And likewise, you could and I don't know the particular history of this person, but I mean, you could go and do those, marches and be fighting for what's right. And at the same time, go and like put on your fucking blackface to do your job.
Yeah.
I mean, in other words, there's a practical element, and then there is sacrifice that, like, obviously most of the sacrifice was borne by the people who were the victims of the apartheid or whatever you want to call it. But I mean, you could do both things. In other words, I think that a lot of this, and I feel like a lot of the general concept of what is offensive and what isn't, when we look at these individual cases, it's about intent.
Yes.
And that's very difficult to gauge regardless of time period. It's difficult to gauge, right now when you look at somebody, but why is this person doing this? Are you doing blackface because like you agree that black people should not be allowed to portray themselves, to have, jobs in acting and so on and so forth? Or are you doing this because you want for there to be some sort of a representation? I mean, that's a night and day difference, no pun intended, actually. But that's a night and day difference. And I feel like that's everything when it comes to that argument. And yet it's very difficult to really read that unless you study that individual person, as is always the case with intent.
Another part of the story as well is that she performed 2 specific songs that are considered to be offensive. One was called "That's Why the Darkies Were Born." And if you look at the lyrics, really not even anti-black people. This song was covered by a civil rights activist. So I'm pretty sure that if it was anti-black people, this person would not have done that. So it's sort of just looking at the title and being like, oh, okay, yeah, no, it's racist. And then the other song, and this is, you get a little bit more, I'll give the devil its due.
Sure.
Like, this song was a ill-fated attempt at a nursery rhyme for black children.
Okay.
And it's like pretty much every stereotype that you could possibly imagine. But then
Swing
again,
and a miss.
Yeah. But then again, if you don't try to do things like that in that early phase, do you ever get to the actual racial tolerance that you want? Because it has to be some sort of incremental baby steps at that point.
I don't think that it has to be, but that's certainly the way that it is.
Yes.
I mean, as far as has to be, I think that like in a perfect world, people who are racist wake up one day and they're not anymore, and like everything's hunky dory. That's obviously not how the world actually works. It is transitional in that regard. It doesn't have to be that way, but it's the way that it is.
It's the most realistic possibility.
Yeah.
Because
you're dealing with people.
You're dealing with people, and you're going to just do a sudden rush. Like a sudden change. People don't adapt well to sudden change like that to begin with. I also wanted to, before I completely drop this, the reason this all ties into the flyer thing is that this woman, first of all, it was a woman. And if you want to do this whole bullshit that you're like, oh, we're going to stand up for women's rights and all that stuff. This is a woman that got very popular in a time frame that most women were not very popular. She was also not an attractive woman. She was very fat. So for her,
that's attractive to some of us then.
Typically. So in order for her to hit that level of mainstream success, and then throw her to the curb after you've used her for her own popularity in the 70s and 80s and all that stuff, in the time when you need someone, when she needed to be defended, and you kind of knew who this person was because there were players in there, like, she's not a racist. You didn't do anything. You made no attempt to defend this person.
That's also the thing, and it's kind of like, people are kind of inherently lazy when it comes to this sort of thing. Yeah. And they're not going to put in the work to look into what the situation and the history of it and all that. People just like to knee-jerk reaction things.
I am trying to find the exact quote, but I did find this as well because when I first heard about this, and I'm like, really? Was this actually a thing? I actually like to know what the problem was.
Right.
And then I looked into the lyrics of that one song. I was like, oh, okay, that's kind of a reach. And then I found the quote, and I don't have it on me right now. Sure. I can try and pull it up. But on her radio show, I looked into her history. On her radio show, she made a fucking impassioned cry to end racial and religious, and there was another factor in there, maybe it was cultural or ethnic intolerances. She fucking said it on a radio show. She had civil rights leaders on her radio show. She worked with black musicians. You're making you're making a tremendous leap to call her a racist in a time where actually kind of being a racist was the norm.
Yeah.
And this pattern that she lived her life in was not of a typical racist that didn't like or wanted to be around black people. If she didn't want to be around black people, would she work for them? Would she call for an end to racism in 1950?
Yeah. And that's, I mean, even more so than these words are getting tossed around. The bottom line is that not only was it typical to be a racist, but obviously that wasn't a term that was even used at the time.
Right.
If you go back to basically, pre-civil rights movement, we're talking, certainly pre-1970s, but obviously there was this escalation that unfolded in the 1950s and 1960s. But the bottom line is that if you were a white person and believed that black people or any other group of people, specifically black, obviously, but any other group of people was in some way equal to yourself, to your fellow white folks, then you were considered un-American. It wasn't even that, this term racist didn't even exist really, other than on paper. So this person was more or less just living in the world and doing the best that they could.
But also at the same time, speaking out at a time, she was actually living the life that most of these quote unquote social justice warriors would expect one to live in that time frame, but it still wasn't good enough.
No.
And the reason that I stopped being a Flyers fan is because in a time where a dead woman needed somebody to stand up for her and be like, hey, we did all this research. We know what's happening. This was not the case. And we're not going to remove her from history.
Well, and it's also so funny. It's such a big organization couldn't put a low-level intern on research duties.
But that's just it. They didn't care about.
Yeah.
They didn't care about the research. It's not about that. It's just about those dollar signs, and that goes back to just like how stupid your average person is when it comes to topics like these, where they're unwilling and in some cases incapable. As much as I hate to throw that around, but certainly like people are not interested in having that conversation and acknowledging the nuances between, basically seeing the way in which it's unfolded, the history of these things, and how you can, represent them, how you can display them. And at the same time, that doesn't necessarily need to be a negative thing.
Yeah.
That we can talk about these subjects and it doesn't inherently make somebody a racist, nor do you need to, or anti anything, not just race, but I mean, sexuality, religion, etc., culture, that we can talk about them and acknowledge the differences that exist between people. And at the same time, it doesn't need to be negative. Because personally, I do believe that there's differences between people in this way, and that obviously history at times has given us a very bad, a very bad light on that, because that shit was real. Like slavery's a thing. The subjugation of huge groups of people just because of their, how they identified themselves, how they were different. That's real, and we can acknowledge it and talk about it, and it doesn't need to inherently be something which is negative today.
But to kind of like the TLDR, too long, didn't really listen to this part of the podcast. You used her. You used her for her popularity when it was necessary for your organization. And then it was time for you to pay it forward. You didn't do it. And I just kind of, at that moment, we're like, oh, yeah, that's right. You're the organization that fired a coach because he had leukemia. No. You're the organization that tried to kill Eric Lindros by getting him on a plane when he had a collapsed lung. You're the organization that had a mutiny against your head coach like 2 months after his wife died of breast cancer. Oh, that's right. You're a shitty organization. I'm done now. This is the last straw. And that's every in my opinion, that's every major corporation. So this would fall into that. That's the government. These large entities they're not trying to do this research. It's not that they've missed it. They're just trying to do damage control and PR.
Yeah, and sometimes not even damage control. I think that very often it behooves them to kind of foment this. That there's an element there where it's beneficial sometimes to divide people, and that certainly I'm of the opinion that the government is good on that type of thing. Like that's what they're good at. But I think that sometimes it's simply like what makes you more money, and sometimes it's that you genuinely want this thing to happen as that large organization. Individual people, I don't think necessarily want that. There's like fringe people. For sure. But like other than that, it's that these large corporations and so on and so forth, sometimes they benefit from it.
And I can tie this in because one of our favorite shows, especially to talk about and to watch. It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. Got itself into a little bit of a problem. I think we mentioned this on the podcast before when they did all of their black and brown face episodes.
Right.
Love those episodes.
And those episodes are great. And to have Hulu pull them from the service misses the point, because the entire point of those episodes was to point out how ridiculous blackface was.
Yeah.
Like the whole first episode is like, we're going to do this tastefully. And the whole point was, no, you really can't do this tastefully.
It's where these big entities really miss the mark. They just cater to the loud voices where, like, I mean, I'll call it what it is. Like the art itself, that piece of the whole, its message is absolutely against blackface. It's to make fun of the whole situation, of how it was used and all this stuff like that. And then
it's satirical.
Yeah.
It's satirical to the fucking 10th power, and it's essentially banned merely because of what it is, without acknowledging that intent.
Yeah.
And it's gotten to that point where it's like, we can't even make fun and criticize that blackface is an absurd thing, and it's good that it doesn't exist anymore. So they did it to show that. And you can't even, you just can't even do that anymore.
It was judged on the content, not the context of what.
Exactly. And there was actually a little bit of a hypocrisy in there too, because I remember when those episodes got pulled, there was an episode of another show that I like, American Dad, where they literally show up to, like, it was an evening of celebrating African Americans, and it had all these celebrities in it.
Sure.
And they show up legitimately in blackface. Now it's a cartoon, but the whole gag is that they just show up and the entire family's in blackface.
No.
And they're like, whoops.
Yeah.
And the next scene, they're all in the car, and they're like, "Oh, guys, what are you talking about? You got to meet Morgan Freeman." It's like, I was prying his fingers off my throat. But
that ain't wrong.
And the whole point of that is that you have these rules for Always Sunny in Philadelphia.
What are these rules?
Yeah, what are the rules?
that is the question of the time.
Because you have a potentially offensive thing with, blackface, but you're not paying attention to the satire. Right. But in this other show, did you just miss it?
Nuance is a hard thing, I guess, these days now.
I guess that's what it comes down to. Yeah, people don't really recognize or acknowledge the subtleties that exist, certainly in comedy.
Right. I mean, comedy, too. Comedy, I think, when it's best, should challenge you and make you think about these things.
Yeah.
It's not something that's just served up on a platter and it is what it is.
I mean, that's like, I personally, racist self aside, I love racist jokes, not for the offensive nature of them, though obviously that's where the comedy lies, but more so it's the alarm that it gets, and also it's that there's like an element where we can laugh at ourselves. I say that as somebody who's I'm mixed, for those of us who can't see us. I'm going to really lay down on that, since obviously everybody else here is white. but it's the ability to kind of joke about these things. Like, honestly, like when I go and hang out with, like Stubbs, or like somebody who's like a fucking super proper black man, like we exchange fucking black jokes left and right because they're funny. Yeah. That's really all that it is. And obviously they're like enormous stereotypes, and they are like offensive. And if they were said in a way that was, like by somebody who was a genuine person who had hatred in their heart kind of thing, then that would be a different story. But the bottom line is that there's humor in it. And I think that when a person has humility and so on and so forth, it's fun to laugh at yourself. It's fun to laugh at the stereotypes that are associated with whatever group you happen to identify with. And that's what's really lost. And going back to these original points that were made by yourself, Dan, that it's a white knighting scenario. Yeah. And it's the people who are getting so pissed about it, they can't tell those same jokes that I'm telling at the bar. They shouldn't be telling them. They shouldn't be. It's like one of those things where it's fun, and maybe you say it in secret, but don't walk into a fucking black bar and then bust out your best fucking racist humor. Yeah. That's not a cool thing to do.
Know your audience.
Exactly. Yeah. Know the audience.
Know your audience, and be very aware of your intentions of what you're doing.
And that's what it is. It's that I think that everybody, every human being that I've met, obviously there's exceptions there, but every human being that I've met, they've got every decent person that I've met, they've got that humility to them where you can enjoy those jokes. You can laugh at yourself, even when the joke is obviously a dig against your group. Yeah. But that's what makes it funny. That's the whole thing. Moses, with you, I fucking tell I-tie jokes about you all the goddamn time. I have no idea what you actually are.
Yeah, I'm not even Italian.
I know that your family's mostly Italian. So, and some of those are super fucking racist, and I'm not Italian at all. So I've got no right to be telling those jokes, but it's done in good faith, at least for your family, not for you. With you, they're genuinely racist.
Well, yeah. I hate you. That goes for everyone.
But that's also another point too, because in a previous episode, we also talked about the episode of The Simpsons that had Gay John.
Yeah.
And that was actually, you have to weigh like that episode would be offensive today. But you would learn like a lot about gay people and gay culture if you actually paid attention to like the themes of it. But there was a lot of gay jokes in it, like hot stuff coming through. Like the entire steel industry and the railroads, they're all gay. But then there was also too, like there was the scene with John and Smithers, and he ditched him to hang out with the Simpsons.
Oh, that's right.
And then he was just like, oh, I know John, or I know the Simpsons. And he leans into John. He's like, so this is your sick mother?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And so those could seem like they're stereotypes, but also at the same time, you can be like, oh, well, the whole thesis of that episode is I'm no different than you. Like the whole thing that Homer has to learn through the entire arc of that story is that if every gay man would save his life, then he'd be set.
And that's just it. They are stereotypes.
Yes.
I mean, like that's like the way in which you convey stories very often. You know, if you were telling one of these jokes and you just made the person like everyone else, then it wouldn't be conveyed. You wouldn't have any way of really understanding that this is meant to portray some sort of a levity about a group that you were otherwise judging. So, I mean, we lean on stereotypes to identify groups that both we choose to identify other groups, however we choose to do that as individuals. And then obviously people choose, like I was saying before, we choose to identify with certain groups. You know, I choose to belong to, you know, however I identify myself. Moses, you're gay and Italian. I don't know what it is, but we all do that to whatever degree that we do. And I think that when you look at something like that with The Simpsons or any one of these like classic, you know, stereotypes, archetypes, etc., that's being done for a reason. Like you can go, once again, you can get people who like do it to a point where it's meant to be offensive. But like if you look at that character of Gay John, he was a great person. Like he was a genuine human being. He was delightful in every way. He was the funniest guy in the episode. Everyone wanted to be friends with him. And Homer adored him right up until the point that he found out he was gay. And then Homer was a homophobe, basically, you know, and he had to basically realize, as you said, Homer realized that the man that I saw before, it has nothing to do with him being gay. He's just a great guy. And I was wrong for thinking that just because he's gay, he's different from the man that I knew.
It's essentially like the lesson of the episode. It goes back like the old Aesop fable stuff and like all the way through like modern times. Like that's what it is. It's a learning experience. It's not to be making fun of a gay character. It's to show that, you know, that's not a differentiator that should be used against them.
And on top of that, as a little side note, I'm a big advocate of the notion that stereotypes that we build, they do exist for a reason. They're not universally applicable. You know, certainly, you know, I mean, there's, you know, to use that Gay John thing, he had the lisp. He was a flamboyant gay man.
But that's his voice.
Yeah, right. Well, I know. Yeah, that was John Waters. John, the pinnacle of the gay community, you know. So the stereotypes, you know, stereotypes are based off of real things. And I think that that's what it is. It's that it's also okay to talk about stereotypes and to deal with stereotypes and to employ them in this way because they are based off of observed realities. But it doesn't mean that every gay man is John Waters. There's a lot of fluidity in there. But at the same time, it's like the way in which like stereotypes are inherently portrayed as always wrong or always negative. I don't see that. I think that, you know, like I'm Spanish. I like to cook things in foil. That's a fact.
I mean, to add on to that, I'll give an example. Like my uncle was he's no longer with us, but he was a gay man and he was a gay farmer. So he didn't fit that stereotype of, you know, like the flamboyant gay man.
But he certainly fit the ideal for some gay men.
Yes. Well, I mean, listen, he was a farmer, but also had pygmy horses and chihuahuas. So
so there you go. There's the gay.
But he used to roll laughing at those like stereotypical portrayals. He thought it was so fucking funny.
Yeah. I think that there's real value in that. This like white knight society kind of like overlooks and omits. And I think that it's again, if it's done with like good intent, then I think that that's super valuable. I fucking like my mom's Jewish, as you guys know. I tell Jew jokes all the fucking time and they're hilarious. And as I tell you, Dan, very often, my mother calls me up and like, she's like pretty fucking Jewish. But she calls me up and she's just like, oh no, I just wanted to let you know that I'm still alive. Yeah. And it's like, I mean, it is the stereotype. I mean, she's doing the Jew jokes now, and better than I ever could.
Every time you tell me one of the stories about your mother, I always think of that bit Lewis Black did. He's like, my mother isn't so much a stereotypical Jewish mother. She's taken a much darker.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. She's like doing it she's creating new stereotypes.
But speaking of the stereotype aspect, and while we're talking about The Simpsons, that was a big to do with the character Apu.
Yes.
And I forget the name of the dude, but he did like a documentary called The Problem with Apu.
Yeah.
And the whole basis was that Apu was a stereotype of like Indian culture and all that. And it was, it negatively impacts like, the Indian community. Mm-hmm. Now I sit here being white as fuck. Mm-hmm. So like maybe I don't have a leg to stand on, but I remember watching The Simpsons being, a kid watching it 6, 7, 8, 9 years old. Well, still going on, but I don't watch it anymore. No. But like up until, I don't know, somewhere around 2000 when I kind of like, all right, this show isn't very good anymore. I learned more about Indian culture and Hinduism from The Simpsons and from the Apu character than I did until I started taking classes about religion in college.
Yeah.
So that brings up the point of not every stereotype can be negative because you can learn something about it. Now, are there going to be a few assholes that approach you
that's always going to exist.
Like, "Fuck you, come again." Mm. Like, yes, of course that's going to happen. People are inherently flawed. People are going to be fucking dicks. I can walk into any place and a person's going to come up to me and be like, "Hey, you're short and you're fucking I'd probably kick your ass." It's just going to happen. You're always going to catch shit. It's a part of, first of all, being a man. Mm-hmm. You can't take shit, then I'm sorry. Like, I guess live in San Francisco? I don't know what the fuck you're supposed to do.
It's full of what?
But what do you guys think about that concept of essentially banning a Poe and then weighing the benefits of having them and also weighing the cons to having them on the show?
So when I watched The Simpsons when I was young, like I think probably around the same cutoff when I stopped watching, the early 2000s, somewhere around there, I never saw Apu's character in like a negative light in any way, shape, or form. And like, there were times that were more Apu-centric episodes that like you learned cultural stuff. So I never had a problem with it. I know you brought up this documentary. I don't think I ever watched it, to be honest with you.
I'm doing a Peter Griffin right now. I've read part of a review online. I'm not a fan.
But I remember it being a thing because that was Hank Azaria that voiced Apu, right? And I know like he had to come out and make an apology and stuff like that on the back end of it. And it just all seemed crazy to me. It was all fine. And like, I don't think, and I'm like, I can't speak for that culture, but I don't think he was ever shown and like mocked or made to be in a negative light in any way, shape, or form.
He was a stereotype
absolutely.
of a typical immigration story from India and the surrounding territories. Mm-hmm. Of somebody who comes to this country and they're running the convenience store. We all recognize that.
Absolutely.
First and foremost, that's a real story. Not for nothing. I go to gas stations around here, and locally owned ones are very often owned and operated by people who are from India, the surrounding territories. They're very often Sikh people, and I chat with them every now and again. They speak excellent English, probably better than my own, and I get to have like full conversations. Very often, I speak with people who are more recent immigrants, and this is their only thing. And to a degree, the whole "thank you, come again" is a reference to the limited language that so often exists at convenience stores and gas stations. This is a typical job that people lend with. That said, on the show, Apu was in never any way depicted in a negative light, even though he was a stereotype. So I felt like it was a positive thing. On the note of what you were asking, Dan, in terms of like, what can we learn from this? Yeah, I mean, like as a kid, I didn't go to a gas station and talk to people there. I was a child, So I did learn a little something about another group of people. I mean, basically just obviously very basic shit, but nonetheless, that's like a learning experience in and of itself. Even if you're just taking away something basic, like, I don't know how to word it, but it's like, that the stereotype of these people that you run into as a kid, where you're not talking to them, but that that they're from another country, they have an accent, you see your parents interacting with them. So seeing Apu on The Simpsons, at the very least, taught me that these people are non-threatening. There's probably, obviously there's exceptions to every rule, but nonetheless, I think that that's a real thing. So I feel like, that's just like another application where it's that there's something to learn from this, and it isn't inherently negative just because we're acknowledging that there's realities to these stereotypes that we have. So I feel like Hank Azaria having to apologize, and obviously that just goes back to that he's white. And of all of the ethnicities that I am not Indian. So I'm probably going to be doing an apology in about a week as well. But personally, myself, for all of these things that I'm not offended by somebody who's of another ethnicity or group doing something that I guess belongs to my group, because it goes back to my personal sentiments is that, like, why does it really matter? Because, like, I'm drawing these lines because they're valuable to me, but that doesn't mean that they should have to apply to you. In other words, the line that we draw between, the Apu stereotype, and now let's put that into a real world person. These people that I go and like chit chat with as best I can at the gas station, I hang out with this one guy named Singh who speaks barely any fucking English at all. So our conversations are extremely limited. And yet, the little bit that we're able to communicate with each other, me and this guy have so much in common. We're both like regular fucking dudes who are living in New Jersey now, trying to make money, trying to get by. He's working his job when I'm there. I'm leaving mine or going to it. Everything is still very relatable. So these nuances of difference are like almost arbitrary to me. So the idea that, like, if I ever had to, in some hypothetical scenario, if Singh ever gets famous and, they're looking for somebody to portray him, I would not feel any type of like betrayal by doing that, because the difference between me and him in my mind is very negligible, despite the obvious differences that exist between us. But I think that that's true even when, like, I am the same ethnicity or religion or sexuality or from the same region as somebody else, Dan, would you be offended if I portrayed you in something? Would I have to go and apologize for that?
You probably do a better voice. But like the stereotype of Apu that was the running gag is that he was always working.
Yeah.
He was an incredibly hard worker. It's like, when he got married, I remember in one of the episodes, his wife asked Marge, like, you're telling me your husband doesn't work a standard, like, 18-hour day?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
He was always working at the Quickie Mart. His biggest affront to his character is that eventually he cheated on his wife. But that was also because they had like 8 kids.
Yeah.
So it's just like, all right. And that's not really a stereotype against that culture.
No, that's
a stereotype might be against the culture with the 8 kids thing. Yeah. I don't know if that's actually even a stereotype for that. I'm just pulling that out of my ass.
Right.
But all of the characters on The Simpsons are stereotypes.
Exactly.
Every single one.
Exactly.
So like, if Apu is the least offensive, no, you could say like his voice is the most offensive aspect of him, and it's because it's portrayed by a white guy. Mm-hmm. But then how much more offensive would Chief Wiggum be? Yeah. Because Chief Wiggum is like the epitome of being an incompetent, fat, lazy cop who shoots the high school basketball captain in one of the episodes.
Yeah. He thinks he's a monster.
Yeah. But he was turning into a monster, though.
He was. Yeah, well, I mean, in fairness, I absolutely stereotype cops as the only non-white person here. So that's a fact.
So did The Simpsons.
Yeah.
But damn near every character in that show. Groundskeeper Willie, is another one.
Homer is a stereotype of average white dude.
Yeah.
Average
and
white.
He's an idiot. He's depicted as being a blue-collar idiot, essentially.
Marge is a stereotype of like a 50s housewife.
Yeah.
Bart is the freaking Dennis the Menace freaking stereotype. Lisa is like, she became more of like a social justice warrior type stereotype later on, but she was more of like a brainy, like the brainy daughter stereotype
the nerd,
at the beginning.
The jazz guy, Bleeding Gums
Murphy.
Yeah.
Every single character. You were saying this before we started, Moses. Mayor Quimby. He's just
the Kennedys.
He's just a Kennedy. And he is literally just, one of the Kennedys. And they list off all of the negative aspects of him in one of the best episodes, Sideshow Bob Roberts, with the Rush Limbaugh parody. The tax cheating, wife swapping, pot smoking, spendo crack, Diamond Joe Quimby. And he's like, hey. And I missed this gag too when I was a kid. I did not realize he was watering a freaking weed plant. And he's I don't know, why is he listening to Rush Limbaugh? And then he just says, hey, I am no longer illiterate. That was the part that he took the most umbrage with. But yeah, if you're going to get like upset with some stereotypes, honestly, I get it. Like if you feel like you're being negatively affected by these characters, okay. But there's a lot of positive to it. Mm-hmm. And so when you do stuff that's mostly negative, and I'll give the devil his due, in that documentary, he talked to his parents. And his parents like, not really bothered by this character. It seems fine. That's not really offensive at all. So it was something that I've been meaning to bring up on this podcast. It seems to be like a generational gap as well. Like people along our age, also my sisters are not too offended by most things,
right?
But they're also kind of got my personality. But like I would say like a generation younger than us tend to be the ones that would be most offended by things. And in our own generation, there certainly are people as well that get, butthurt over this, that, and the other thing. And they're not even the one. We said it on the podcast when we were at the Halloween party, and you were getting accosted for the way you were dressed.
Yeah, that was great.
Listen to a Halloween episode for that story.
Yeah, that's a good one.
But it seems to me like there is a generational gap. Like it's harder to offend.
There is definitely that. And it's a generational gap. It's the ability to send your voice out into the world very easily these days. Media.
There's also an element, and this is me speculating right here, but I think that there is an element to it where if you know people of many different groups. Like, once again, because like the groups are made up. They don't exist in reality. We create them in our minds, as individuals, and then we create them for other people. But I think that if you don't know people from these perceived groups, then you're more likely to be the type that doesn't want jokes to be told about it. Like because it's really, I think that's like an aspect of it. It's that you are excluded from it, not to go in the other direction of like that stereotype of like, I'm not racist because I have a black friend, but it's that I think that there is something where like, if you have a diverse group that you go and hang out with, if you, talk to people, they don't need to be your best friend, but like if you just like talk to a different, a variety of different people, if you're blessed with living in a place like New Jersey where we've got all types here, then I think that you're less likely to be inclined towards that type of thinking. It's that people who have no real, because I like, that's what it is. Like, again, like I hang out with like all sorts of different people. Some of them, like it is only like a friend that I know when I go to get gas, so it's not a real friend, but it's like somebody that I'm friendly with. And then there's like all sorts of ethnic groups where I hang out with them like much more intimately. And I think that when you have those experiences, you realize that people are basically okay with making fun of themselves, with these jokes. And I think that if you're like a younger person and you're in like a suburb, like we'll go with this, the stereotype of the white suburb, and you don't have these groups to go by, you feel excluded from this awareness that all of a sudden these groups are different from you. Because like I certainly don't feel that way. I don't feel like any of these other groups that we've discussed are different from me. Yeah. Because I've interacted with all of them. They're all basically the same. Everybody's the same.
When you kind of live in a monoculture, like the other becomes like a challenge.
That's what I mean. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so people are more inclined to, because you have to reconcile that in your own head and say like, am I okay with telling this joke about, black people or Sikh people or Spanish people or whatever, and you feel like I like to a degree, because I've exhibited it myself. It's like, should I be telling this joke? Yeah. I wouldn't tell half of the racist Italian jokes that I tell if not for Moses basically staring at me blankly afterwards and not punching me in the face, which to me means that it's basically okay. I think there's an element of that there.
Yeah, there's something to that too. If I can tell you a quick story about how I spent my night a couple days ago. I went out with somebody at the bar. Maybe I'll have to edit this out.
It's off to a great start, Dan.
But I go to one bar, have a good time there, go to another bar. It's a little bit closer to where she lives. And at one point,
I know this. Yeah.
she goes to the bathroom, and I'm seated right next to a black gentleman.
Sure.
And, he starts talking to me. It's like, how long have you lived around here? And I'm like, I've pretty much lived here my entire life. It's like, when did you go to this particular high school? I'm like, yeah, I only went to high school around these parts for 1 year. And then I moved down south for a little bit and went there. It's like, oh, okay. It's like, what year did you graduate? And I'm like, oh, yeah, 2003, I graduated. It's like, damn, nigga, you old as shit. And
you should keep that in there, Dan. Yeah. I'm giving you a pass right now. I'm using my black card for it.
First of all, I'm quoting a black man. I just immediately started cracking up about that. Because first of all, it pokes fun at two things. One, that dichotomy between our different races. Mm-hmm. And also at the same time, making fun of how old I am.
Yeah.
I have no idea how old he was, but I was just like, wow.
No, okay. Listen, Dan, black don't crack.
Yeah.
He was probably 60.
It was done with good intentions. Yeah, had a laugh.
Yeah. But also in a certain context too, like they've said it with like Hulk Hogan, kind of bringing you in there, where it's just like that word in the black dialect is like brother.
Yeah.
Right.
Brother, you're old as shit.
And
That was just a poker chick.
it depends entirely on context,
Yeah.
which goes back to that point that I was making, which is that, like, if you sit down, for myself, like, who likes to frequent bars, surprise, it's that if I hear somebody telling a racist joke, right? And it's like a good one. And by that, I mean, it's super fucking racist, you know? And it's like, cause I've been in this situation where it's like, I've heard, like, you know, white people telling, you know, like a black joke, and sometimes there's a black guy there. Sometimes there isn't. Yeah. And I can jump in on that, and it's like a fun thing. And I pride myself on having the most racist of jokes typically. But there's other times where I'm like sitting at the bar and it's like late on a Saturday and it's like a bunch of bros, you know, and they're like, whatever, like college dudes, you know, with like bleach blonde tips, whatever the fuck the style is these days. And they're telling a racist joke, and I feel like it's a genuine like, racist thing. Yeah. Like, I'll fucking say something, you know, and it's about that context. And obviously that's my perception of what their context is. But I'm personally not offended if it's being told in good jest, you know? And I think that that's the way that everybody should approach it. That jokes are jokes, fun is fun, and we can acknowledge these things and talk about them. But if they're being done in this more genuine kind of way, where it does go back to this question of like, is there animosity here? Then I think that that's problematic, you know? And then I'll personally feel in that way where I'm like, well, I don't really want to hear, you know, like if you're just like telling jokes amongst your friends, you know, at enough volume that I can hear it, like people telling racist jokes and I can't hear them. It's like, that's fine, because I know that's a thing, you know. That's a classic joke of like, how does every white person sort of joke? Yeah. You know, they should fucking looking around. You know, so it's like, I know that as a thing. That's not a problem. But like, if you're telling them at full volume and you're not like cool about it, well, then you could be like, maybe there's somebody at that bar who is like, you know, of color or whatever, and maybe you are making them uncomfortable with it. And I've observed that happening before, and then it does piss me off, you know, because it's like, you could have told it quietly enough that nobody else heard it, in which case that's fine. That's your private joke, you know, we've all been there, you know, or you don't need to tell it at all. And also, I'm clearly making a judgment of how you're perceiving other groups of people, because I personally take that offense to racism, except for when I'm doing it, of course.
because then it's not racism.
Right. No, exactly. Yeah. When I do it, it's awesome.
And like also, like if you're doing it with good intentions and it like catches somebody sideways and stuff, talk about it, you know, like
exactly. Kind of read their reaction to what.
Yeah, exactly. I'll share this with you. I don't, Dan, you might have to edit this out. I embarrassed myself the other day. Just real quick, we were at we went down to Atlantic City, and I'm sitting with Nick and my lady, and like I had like 2 or 3 whiskeys, but I was on an empty stomach, so I was like just the right type of loosey goosey. And there was a group of men walking up who were like younger than myself, so they were like in their mid-20s, let's say, and they were all wearing the same Hawaiian shirt, and I'm a big fan of Hawaiian shirts, so I'm offended when anyone else wears one. And they were walking up, they were identical, and they were maybe like 10 feet away. It's a casino, it's a bar. And I looked at Nick and I was like, look at this faggot shit right here. I have no homophobia in me, by the way, just for the audience. But I was like, look at this faggot shit right here. And it's just like, I don't know, it was just being funny to me. And the guy who was standing right next to us was the bachelor, and that was his bachelor party. And he looks at me and he goes, well, thanks. And Nick looks at me and she's like, what the fuck, dude? And I had to like try it, and I very rarely try and backpedal out of something because I try and own my shit, but like clearly I embarrassed myself, and I was like, dude, I'm sorry. I was like, they are gay shirts, but like I'll buy all of you drinks right now because clearly I've just dug a ditch. You know?
Oh, goodness gracious.
Yeah, it was
Foot
a fun time.
in mouth.
Yeah, it really was. I was quite embarrassed. Yeah, fortunately, Nick forgave me because she knows that I'm one to do these things. But I did apologize, and I told him, you know, it's okay. My Hawaiian shirt is better, but those are very nice. And then he actually pointed out that those Hawaiian shirts were custom made and had his face all over them, which I didn't notice, which is so much gayer than what I thought, but also funnier. So,
but also at the same time, kind of like the thesis of this entire episode, in order for you to try to make that joke, you had to risk being offensive.
Yeah.
And you hit it.
Yeah. Oh, I definitely hit it. Yeah. Thank God they weren't all gay. Then I would have actually I would have really owed some like daiquiris or whatever it is. Yeah, I don't know.
Oh, normally I have a good transition, but you kind of got me with that.
I got you, Ben.
Yeah. Oh, mercy. Well, if you enjoyed this episode, you didn't think it was offensive, or maybe if you thought it was offensive, but it was your type of offensive, make sure that you subscribe to this podcast. Leave us a 5-star review. Check us out on YouTube and Rumble. Make sure that you like, comment, share, and hit that notification bell so you can get updated on when our content is available. Follow us on social media. We are at Loud and Drunk on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. And make sure that you bookmark loudanddrunk.com. Catch up on the podcast there, merch, and we'll be adding more features as we go along and improve the website. So for Justin, Moses, and Barbarian Jim, you kind of redeemed yourself. We might have you back one day.
I would love that.
Maybe.
Right.
We got to find out who's booking these guests, though.
Yeah. I'll wait for the phone call.
I will actively try this time.
I thought it was the cat.
Is it? Has it been Fury this whole time?
Yeah,
Oh my
Fury.
God. You know what? We'll get back to you on that.
Who made the retarded cat the intern?
Yeah. Well, Dan, you need look no further than the mirror.
And on that note, I'm Dan. And until next time, this was Loud and Drunk.
Thanks for joining. Bye.